Hey there, everybody. It's Eternal Snowman here. Um, Give me a few minutes to update my the Twitch title, and then we'll go ahead and begin. Hopefully, it's not take too long. Okay, here it is. Okay. 7 recap. Semifinal predictions plus team play season recaps. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to go through all of the matches from last week, like the usual. Before we do that, I'll set up the stage for like what the teams needed coming into this week, and then I'll also go through for the teams that got eliminated what I think that they did wrong coming into the season, and then I'll look at the teams that are in playoffs and do a quick breakdown of all of the matchups in playoffs. Since it's only going to be 2 matchups, I'll try to go more in depth than I normally do. So starting off with this week, what every team needed. So the Snoms needed a relatively big win along with the hatterines losing. So the hatterines winning or losing actually was the catalyst for a lot of teams to make it into playoffs. So it was like the hatterines and the Gudras were like the most important matchup alongside the Bolts and the Rufflets. So the Bolts and Rufflets and the hatterines Gudras matchup was very important for all the teams. So the Swamperts, they didn't have any stake in this week. I'm pretty sure their players were taking it pretty easy. They didn't really need anything big for this week. They were already qualified for playoffs. They were almost guaranteed the first seed as long as we didn't win and they lost. We as in the Snorlaxes. But we didn't win. We also didn't try because we also didn't have very much of a stake this week. So Fristo versus Tempering. Tempering won. A lot of these games also ended up like being like kind of clown fiesta games because they were after they basically all the results were decided. So a lot of these games didn't actually end up like being real games, as in there's like a lot of meme teams or other things happening. So I don't put too much stock in this. The Snoms were like in a dominant position early. A lot of their players were doing well, and I'll just quickly go through all the matches. Like Lugia Numero did manage to pick up a win, which was good for him. And then Thunderbirds also beating Maroon, who underperformed this entire season, along with Mishimono, but that was like basically after the results were decided. Then Hatterines versus Gudras. In this matchup, the Gudras really needed to win, and they needed to win by big. The important matches to look at were SMB versus Sensei Axio, where SMB losing was actually like very bad for them. Also, a lot of these other matchups, like Dugza versus Decim, was relatively impactful as well. The Rufflets really dominated the Bolts. The Bolts having a very significant lack of depth, notably Mikav losing, as well as a lot of their other players not being able to step up when they really needed it. For example, Not Mian, APW, all these players who have shown that they can be good earlier in the season, just didn't play well in this matchup. Um, so because of that, they were knocked out of playoffs. They needed to win this matchup for sure to be able to get in. Well, they could have tied with the Hatterines also losing, but with this other situation going on, the Bolts were basically guaranteed if they did manage to win. So it would have been good for them. And then in the last matchup, ourselves versus the Thelakazams, we didn't really try too hard. A lot of the games ended up being like throwaway games, so there isn't too much to analyze for the matches from last week. I wouldn't take a lot away from this last week because playoffs were already kind of set, and a lot of what happened this week didn't really change anything in terms of the only team that would really had any stakes in this were like the Bolts and Rufflets realistically, and the Hatterines as well. But because they all managed to show up basically how we would expect them to in this season, it ended up being kind of like what we would have expected coming into this week. So I wouldn't take too much. Like I would take the records of the end of the season as a grain of salt, because I actually don't think this is like the 1 to 8 right now that the teams should be ranked in, because notably notably there's a few things to note. So the Swamperts lost updated Kanto, meaning that they are like probably weaker than their record or they're weaker than their record probably shows. We also lost against the Zams this week, although we didn't, and notably we didn't give our best effort. We didn't put in our best lineup. Um, Also, I think teams like the Bolts, who technically finished in seventh, but I think if you go by like how strong they were throughout the season, they were probably the fifth best team in the league. So there's like a lot to unpack here. We'll start here at the bottom. I'll go through all of the different teams and kind of give my diagnosis on why they weren't able to succeed, and like what they could have potentially done better. So we'll start off with the eighth team in the league, the Gudras. I think the Gudras were very clearly the weakest team this season. I think that they managed to pick up a win on the Alakazams when they were struggling, but throughout the entirety of the season, they didn't have a lot of strong performers. Their best player was clearly SMB, but SMB had an off season. He wasn't able to pick up a lot of wins against the top other doubles players as many people would have expected, and wasn't able to pick up a win in RU when it really mattered. So he lost to TTT, and he lost to Sensei Axu. And it was like very clearly that although he was the best player here, he wasn't able to perform. A lot of other players that we would have expected to do decent, like Gun J and Gorex, maybe we expect to pick up a few wins, weren't able to perform at all. And then other players who showed some glimpses of promise, like Starreal and Parivard, and even Solarflare RO, ended up on a downtrend towards the end of the season, losing a lot of their important games in critical weeks. And so it ended up being that Toasted Buns was the one who ended up providing them with a lot of important wins, alongside X Skelly, who definitely managed to pick up a few important wins as well towards the end of the season. But overall, their team just underperformed in general, and it seemed to me like they didn't have a clear direction. So I've heard that Poison Adhesive was himself and was really looking for this as like kind of a for fun season. And all power to him if that's what you want out of the season. I'm not going to say that's wrong, but like it's not the best way to cultivate a winning environment, which is really important. And overall, like if they wanted to do better, it had to be a mix of some players having to step up from having like weaker performances, especially the ones that you spend bigger money on, like Gorex. Uh, and also having your player manager actually be like worth that 12.5K. I think having only played one game, although he did win it, Poison Adhesive should have stepped in for either more games or not gone as a player managing slot, and instead tried to pick up other players with that money that he spent on himself. So I think like between those two mixes, the Gudras I think had a really weak roster to start off with. So I think the biggest place that they should have improved in is that draft. But also throughout the entire weeks, you can see a lot of their players have like a bunch of slash tiers. They needed to have a clear direction on where to move, like whether that be, having a strong, like developing some players to eventually become good, or like some way of like moving forward. And at some point, they were fourth in the standings, albeit playing against mostly the weaker teams in the league. So I think like if the Gudras were to repeat the season and like wanted to succeed and actually win, then they should have been looking towards having some sort of clear direction, which I think that was their biggest issue throughout this entire season. So I think that for me, I'm not too disappointed in their season though, because I didn't really have high expectations even following draft, or just following draft, because they had like a weak position from in my opinion, because he didn't really, or like they didn't have clear star players. Their mediocre players were like, or like a lot of their roster was very mediocre slash hadn't shown any potential in the past for me. So while there were a few players who I would say have stepped up and have shown a little bit of potential, like Solar Flare RO and even Star Real, I think have shown good wins. I think overall as a team, and especially Toasted Buns, I think as a team they just didn't draft enough like oomph behind the team. So I think a lot of their issues came from the draft, but I would also say that at the same time they could have potentially made playoffs with this roster if they had chosen a more clear direction. So moving on to my projected overall second team, it was the Alakazams. The Alakazams for me um, were just behind us in the preseason rankings for myself. So out of the seven other teams, I ranked them as the best, and they ended up finishing seventh overall, which is really bad, obviously. But where do they like? Why did they finish so badly? So I would say that a big portion of their draft came down to the fact that they wanted to get five basically strong, really, really strong players, and then fill out their draft with like kind of younger player or like slash newer players slash people who could have potential, or like just cheap veteran players. And to an extent, I liked their draft a lot. I think they drafted a lot of strong players. I think most notably they got their hands on both Ham, Ziri, and Twixtree, which was one of the strongest three-player cores in the tournament. However, all of those players ended up not perform, or Twixtree, other than Twixtree, Ham and Ziri did not perform to the level that we would expect from them. Ham notably losing a lot of important games that could have boosted them in the standings. And Ziri also having a very poor performance, starting off 1-4. And I think like although they had a very clear direction in which they wanted to head with like a very clear plan going in, they did run into quite a few issues. Most notably that Jaren or Akashi was unwilling to really work with the team. He has gotten banned from BLT, and I would say that on the note of Jaren, I won't talk too much about it, but like I would say that although we expected the behavior before, it is very dangerous to draft these kind of players, and it's dangerous in general to have these kind of players around because it just feels like they are like toxic to the entire team. They don't like show good. Even if they show good results, it's not like good for the environment. So like I would strongly encourage people to not be like these kind of people who like learn from this example as like a negative example to show that like you shouldn't be like a toxic person. It's just not like a good thing to do. But anyway, so for them, I feel like if I were to change something, I don't actually think that anything that they did wrong, or they didn't really do anything wrong in the sense that like through draft, through their direction, I don't really see anything, but it just feels like some of their players had to perform better. So, I mean, you could go through draft and say like, okay, maybe you shouldn't draft Jaren or you shouldn't do these things, but like a lot of these things you don't have the foresight for, and like myself included, because I would have never expected them to do so poorly. Um, but they ended poorly, and I would say that throughout this entire season, they were probably around the seventh best team in the league. Okay, technically their standing has them sixth, but I have them much better than the Bolts. Or sorry, I have the Bolts as much better than them. So I would say that while the Alakazams ended up in like just outside of playoff spot, I would say that their season was very disappointing considering that they should have been a team that was challenging for the playoffs. And I think one of the biggest weaknesses of their roster was that they did need their strong players to perform. And while that would be very good in a playoff setting, because if you have five strong players, it seems very difficult to beat. And you go into tie, even if one of those five strong players lose, you can get ties and then go into tiebreaker. Throughout an entire season, if you have some underperforming players amongst your stars, then it can be very, very troublesome. And we saw that this season with both Ziri and Ham not performing up to their price tag slash like their expectations in the case of Ziri. And Unfortunately, that is the case. I mean, I'm sure that they were. It was like a good experience at least for MJ because he wanted to get Ham with him. Like I would have loved to get Ham this season, but he went for way more than I was. We were willing to go 25K on him, but unfortunately, for them, it didn't work out in their favor. And although people will meme the 32K for Ham, I think that it would be very justified in the case that this worked out because like I think in the end their roster did turn out really well, and it was just a few underperformances that kind of stopped them. So while that is the case, the Alakazams did finish out of the playoffs, and they didn't do as well this season as I think many people were expecting from them. So unfortunate for them, but we'll move on to what I would say that the sixth place team in this season, which are the Snoms, who also finished with the same record, however, with slightly better differential. Their team was also built on a very similar foundation that the Alakazams were. I already had them as a mediocre team, like around this range of fifth, sixth area. But I had the I had the uh I didn't really project them to ever make the playoffs because I really thought that while they showed that their team was like or like while their roster was like kind of well rounded across the board, they also didn't show the star potential and like ways of getting consistently getting wins. So their star players also didn't show up very well this season. I had projected Mishimoto to be the best doubles player in this tournament outside of SMB, and both SMB and Mishimoto both underperformed, but Mishimoto especially going 1-5 was a huge surprise to me. He really showed that, or I guess I really overrated him. He wasn't able to adapt to the meta very cleanly. A lot of the teams that he brought, I personally didn't agree with, and he wasn't able to capitalize on the wins even against not doubles mains, like for example Solar Flare RO and Lol Troll Game. And while he also didn't take a win off of any of the like well-known doubles names like Cheese or Z Strats, so it didn't like his performance didn't reflect too well this season. GW was their best performer by far. I think he participated in a pretty heavily stacked NU pool and came out as probably the best player overall in that NU pool. And I would say that he is probably the one that I would look to as like the best performer as well as like the carry of the Snoms. Alongside that, their player manager Tempering, who I didn't rate super highly at the beginning of the season, also performed very well in OU. 4-2 is like a very respectable record, and in a pretty hard OU pool, he played against some pretty good players and was able to pick up some really important wins for his team. On top of that, some of these other players like Plaz and Ramo Lost also performed decently, but overall, the biggest part of their roster that was like a flaw was that Mishimoto wasn't able to perform to the level that was expected coming into the season. And I would say that the Snoms did do like a pretty good job given their roster. They ended up about where I would expect them to. So they didn't really underperform or overperform or underperform their roster, in my opinion. I think that some of their biggest flaws was as a team to draft players that were probably not as motivated, especially Plaz and Mishimoto, who um, have both been kind of um, susceptible to motivation issues in the past. Like they'll be some of the first to admit that, especially Plaz. I think when I say that because Plaz, while he is one of the best LC players around, he definitely has also had issues with motivation in multiple different tournaments in the past. And he has IRL stuff going on and everything, so I don't blame him. But yeah, I would say that other than that, they could have been a good team, but they were just a little too rough around the edge, and weren't able to finish out the season um, as strongly as they would have liked. And then moving on, I think the biggest overperformers of this season were definitely the Bolts. So while the Bolts ended in seventh place, I think the two names that stand out the most to me are Trade and McCav. McCav at one point being 5-0 and Trade finishing the season at 6-0. I think the Bolts really capitalized on having like their strong players really performing well. I think that while they didn't have an overall strong roster, they did have good performances at times from some of their role players, which was important. I think that if I had to change anything for their team, it would be a better draft. Ultimately, they overperformed their roster very heavily, in my opinion. So they had to, they didn't really have much to work with. Uh, they ended up wasting a lot of money at the end, later part of their draft, spending 29K on two players that they didn't even end up using that much. And so if they were to go again, I would say that they could have picked up another star player alongside Trade and McCav, and that could have gotten them over the hump and gotten them enough wins in the end. Sorry. I apologize. That could have gotten them enough wins in the end to be able to creep into playoffs. I think some other things to note is that Snowfall only going 2-3 was kind of an underperformance. However, Snowfall only did go for 12.5K, so that's like not a huge sink of money. I think most importantly that they could have potentially spent more money to get one of those premier doubles players or a premier other player to be able to round out the roster. I also know that like Lightning, for example, Negatory had some motivation issues throughout the tour. So like all of these things can add up, but I think overall their roster was not that strong, and they managed to pick up a lot of important wins and have very strong performing players despite that. So even though they finished in seventh, I would say that they are the biggest overperformance in this tour by far. And they, are good. They looked good for a lot of the season and ended up being in a kind of commanding position for playoffs. It just ended up that they weren't able to capitalize in the last few weeks. So, with that said, those are the four teams that didn't make playoffs. So we can talk a little bit about the teams that did make playoffs and then where their strong points are and why they succeeded. And then we'll talk about the matchups for tomorrow, for this week and next week. So for the Hatterines, I think Z-Strats was the biggest performer for them easily. He did manage to win a lot of the games. He only lost against TTT, and who was one of the other strong players in the pool. And then he won against every single other strong doubles player, including Cheese, who performed very well, including Shadow Monster, including Mishimono, and he had a very strong performance. I underestimated him, ranking him at 5th, although I did say that the 2nd through 6th slots were pretty close, or 2nd through 5th slots were very close. I did put him at the very bottom of that stack, and he showed that I was wrong. So very good job to him. I think that Z-Strats was definitely their big performer, alongside E-Win, who, although he did lose the first game to Fristo, has bounced back and shown to be a very strong player, both here in BLT as well as in World Cup of Pokemon. And although I personally don't love him as a person because of his toxic attitude, it is undeniable that his value as a Pokemon player is very high. Alongside that, you also have GXE, who has been one of the best performers in this tour. He was at some point 4-0, although he's been on a downtrend in recent weeks, losing to Trade, Kather, and not playing this last week. He has only lost to the best of players in both Trade and Kather, both having very dominant records in their own right. So GXC has shown that he is a top player in this pool and has been one of the big reasons that they have succeeded. And I'm sure that behind the scenes, he's also been helping a lot with the prep and everything. So in my opinion, that GXC was one of the big reasons why they were very successful, but they also had a lot of other role players who did decent. Sensei Axu stepped up and managed to pick up 4 wins for them, including, I believe, a win over SMB, yes, in the last week, which wasn't that important, but was kind of their clincher to getting into playoffs. Keeping an Icy going 2-3 in a respectable way, including wins over Twixtree and Tempering, which are pretty big wins. Dugza not performing too well, going only 2-3, but all of these players have were able to pick up wins at some point, and a lot of their players have performed well. I think their biggest weakness has been their LC slot, which has been fluctuating between Skiriku and Jack in My Box. And Skiriku has had kind of a low or like a weak performance so far this BLT, and as well as Peachy Clouds, who hasn't been able to step up to probably his price tag, as well as preseason expectations of him. But other than those two players, I think a lot of their team has been very good, and they do look like a strong contender coming into playoffs. However, they are playing against the Swamperts, who have been the most consistently good team so far. But they definitely could be very good heading into playoffs, and they're a scary team to face. Most notably, I think their tiebreakers are actually pretty strong, with Ewin, Z-Strats, and GXE helming that. Basically they would pick doubles, put GXE in the opponent's tier, and have Ewin play OU. And that three-man lineup is actually very, very strong, and I would be very scared to face that in a tie-breaking set. Now, moving on to the Rufflets. Rufflets, a team that a lot of people didn't really give that much credit to. They were not projected to be an extremely powerful team coming into the season. Also notably that some of the games in our series have already been played, but I'll go into that later. So the Rufflets, they weren't a team that most people predicted to be very powerful. I personally did. I had a pretty high expectation of them coming into the season. I think a lot of their players, I had them as basically a team where they had a lot of strong players across the board, but I actually didn't even anticipate a lot of their players who did step up ended up stepping up in the end. So, for example, Ars9 and Fejiro or S-Mega were two players that I really thought were going to carry the load for them pretty significantly. But in the end, it didn't end up being that way. And the players that were most notable for them were Skipcan, who ended up with a 6-1 record, and Floss, who also ended up with a 6-1 record, although he lost a game in semifinals already. On top of that, they had strong performance in Excelsior, who's 4-0, who I play this week, and then Prodhan, who ended up 4-2, as well as Shadow Monster picking up 4 wins for them, as well as Blumex going 3-2. So all across the board, they have very strong performers. I think other than Ars9, who really underperformed this season, everyone else has either performed or outperformed their price tag, and they have a really strong roster coming into playoffs. I think a lot of people were high on Floss coming into the season, so the fact that he only went for 12K was a huge boon for them. But yeah, so the Rufflets look like a strong team for sure. They ended up finishing second in the regular season, but I think that a lot of things will, if they can bring together Ars9 and into their final roster, a lot of their pieces have been kind of coming together, so they have been looking like a very strong roster, especially in recent weeks. And that is to say that they actually started off the season with a bunch of wins and ties and losses. So they ended up going 3-0 in the last 3 weeks, which is very notable, considering that they played a lot of the strongest teams in those last 3 weeks: the Swamperts, then the Snoms, then the Bolts. Okay, so moving on to ourselves, the Snorlaxes, we ended up in 3rd place. I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but our roster, I still think, is very strong. We have Havens at 6-2, although he ended the season at 5-2, alongside Fellyburn also at 5-2. A lot of our records aren't super reflective because we did end up playing a few kind of throwaway games at the end. But Havens, who has been very good for us, finishing or winning his first game here in the semifinals. Pote going 3-5, also losing his game against Skipcan. So the series is tied 1-1. I think our biggest performers have been Havens, Fellyburn, and Cheese, as well as Kather also picking up very important wins. We have like a very strong top end. I think our biggest weaknesses have been our OU slots, who have been playing decent, but they don't really match up very well against the high tier OU caliber or high caliber of OU slots in the playoffs, and maybe a weakness for us coming into playoff or coming into tiebreakers. But other than that, I think all our other slots have been performing well. I'm very confident in our team overall. And while we have been doing some experimentation, I think like overall as a team, we all have like I think we all have come to the understanding that we are a strong team. I think that we can definitely win this week, but obviously that's personal bias. But we'll see how everything pans out for this entire season. I think like in the end, I think we are still the favorites coming into playoffs. But obviously, I don't think everyone agrees with me. That is definitely some personal bias. But I am pretty confident coming into playoffs that we can definitely take home the trophy this year. I think that many times, or yeah, for this year especially, I think like we have one of the best rosters that I could have thought to put together. So I definitely feel like we're in a good spot this season. So finally, the Swampards, the last roster that we have to go through. I think that their biggest weakness is that they have no longer have their very strong players, or one of their very strong players, and that really hurts them specifically in tie-breaking situations. So right now, their roster will consist of TTT, who has been a very strong performer for at 5-2, Fristo at 4-2, also being a very strong performer, and Bandrizzle also being a very strong performer at 4-1. They also have Dandaman as well as a few other players that are notable. But I think with their playoff lineup, they will have Bandrizzle performing very well, Fristo also performing very well. TMM has been a strong, like a pretty big underperformer for them. He is, to my understanding, like a relatively new person in the scene. 2017, probably not that new, honestly. Dandaman, who has been performing very well, and I think like their biggest issue is that they haven't performed, or because they did come out to such a strong start, a lot of their recent weeks, I feel like they haven't been in form. So they need to really be able to like turn the switch basically, and especially without one of their best players in updated Kanto. Or one of their best players, former best players in updated Kanto. So because of that, they probably are in a pretty rough spot overall. I would say that their record is the most deceiving out of anyone, out of any team in the league, because although they are 5-2 and they have 10 points and they did pick up 5 wins, I think that a lot of their strength, especially in tie-breaking situations, was diminished by the fact that Update Kanto is no longer on the team. And I would say that I wouldn't. I would say that they are probably not the favorites coming into the playoffs. I would say that um, the winner of Rufflets versus Snorlaxes will probably have an easier time than the winners of the Swampards versus Hatterines, but that's also a bit of personal bias, in my opinion, or of my opinion, or whatever. Sorry. Anyway, let's go through the playoff matchups, and I'll break them down individually. So Bandrizzle is playing Dolly or Peachy Clouds in the first round, or in the first game. I think that Bandrizzle has been performing much better throughout this entire BLT. He has been doing very well for himself. I think that he should be very favored in this matchup. I think Fristo versus Ewan is definitely the highlight matchup of this, of this series, with Fristo and Ewan both being extremely good players, and have shown both very strong performances so far. I think that while Fristo did take the first win between the two of them, I think that it also did come down to some luck. It was like a relatively lucky end game for Fristo. I would still favor Fristo slightly, but I think that it's like a very close matchup. In TMM versus GXC, I think this one will be very clearly GXC favored. Dandaman versus Sensei Axu, I also have Sensei Axu here very clearly favored, who has been having a very strong performance throughout this entire season. And while Dandaman has also been stepping up, I do not think that his base level of play is at the same level as Sensei Axie, who has been kind of at the forefront of SSRU throughout the entirety of Smogon, not just in BLT. Notably, Dan DeMann also has the Welsh wall backing him up, but I don't think it'll be enough to overcome that wall. I think Confide is slightly better than Bad Player, although it's very close. I think they both have not shown up to be as good as they, as many people were expecting for both players. And I think, but I think Confide is slightly better here. I've most of his matches he's like are very close, so I think Confide is like slightly better as a player. I'm Just Gray is very much favored in LC. I think Jack and Mike Box has been kind of mediocre overall, so I would say I'm Just Gray is favored here. I think TTT versus Z-Strats is very close. TTT won the first matchup between them, but I think Z-Strats has been performing better overall. And I would favor Z-Strats slightly, but I think it's really close, really close. And then in the final matchup, Dugza versus Thunderbirds, I think this is very heavily in Dugza's favor. I would say that if the series goes as I would expect, then it would be a 4-4 series with the Swamperts winning. Swamperts winning both OU slots, the LC slot, and then one of probably the NU or double slots, and then the Hatterines winning the other 4. And it'll go to tiebreakers, and I would say the Hatterines are pretty heavily favored in tiebreakers. I think that they'll pick doubles, and then the Swamperts will probably pick, I'm not sure, like they just don't really have that many options, and then GXC will probably be able to win. And then I think in this case, I think the Hatterines are pretty favored overall to win this entire series. And in the other matchup, it's the Rufflets versus Snorlaxes. I think a lot of these matchups are very interesting. Blimax versus Roginold is going to be a pretty interesting game. I think the UU game of Kather is probably going to be pretty good. Fellyburn will be probably pretty favored in RU, as long as if Arsenine doesn't step up again. And then the NU game and Mono game have already happened. I think LC is also pretty interesting. LC and doubles are both pretty interesting. I think for doubles, both strong performance so far. Top players clashing in doubles, but LC, I'll be playing against Excelsior, who is currently undefeated. I think a lot of people are actually favoring him, but I'm very confident that I'll be able to win. Obviously, I have a lot of confidence in myself to win these kind of games, but I put a lot of faith in myself. I think in my 2 losses, I lost to I'm Just Gray in a pretty solid game, but the one that I lost to Mikav was he got quite lucky in, so I don't think that my record really reflects exactly how good of a player I am. At 3-2, I did sit out a couple weeks, but I am very confident to be able to win this. I think that I should be able to, if I had to play 4 more games, like one for semis and finals, and then one for tiebreaking both, I'd be pretty confident that I could go 4-0 in LC in the remaining pool. So, whether that's unfounded confidence or not is a different question. But I do think that I would be able to win. Not going to go too much into detail of what my team is preparing for this week, but of course, we have stuff prepared that will be happening throughout this week. So I'm sorry if all of the things that I've been saying in this video are a little bit more ranty. It is a lot longer of a video because it is a season recap. My throat is getting a little bit hoarse because I have been talking for so long. But I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did and you are watching on Twitch, please follow. And if you did enjoy and are watching on YouTube, please leave a like and subscribe. Leave some comments saying what you want to see in the future. Let me think. I may consider doing a live game analysis for the LC game I'm playing this week, but no absolute promises on that, but we'll see. If I do remember and I if I remember and I'm feeling in the mood at the time, then I'll do that. But I may not. I may not. We'll see. But if you do really want to see it, then leave a comment saying that you do. But I think that's about it for this video. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week for the finals. Whether or not we make it, I'll still be making the video, of course. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next week. And I hope we do make it to playoffs. Or